Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when the night felt a little darker, when people whispered about strange women in forests, and everyone's neighbor was probably, a witch. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe let your tea go lukewarm, because tonight we're not talking about the victims of witch hunts. We're talking about the women who started them. Yes, those women. The noble wives, the abbesses, the midwives with just a bit too much influence. The ones who, somehow, decided that the best way to stay safe from accusation was to start accusing others first. It's a story that begins not in the dark forests of folklore, but in parlors, convents, and kitchens, places that smelled of rosewater and gossip. And as we'll see, many witch hunts weren't started by angry mobs or pious priests, but by women who discovered that fear was a powerful currency. Let's float back to Europe, roughly the 1400s. The Middle Ages are winding down. People are discovering new continents, new stars, and unfortunately, new ways to destroy each other. The church is still the great power, suspicious of everything, especially women who seem too confident. Doctors are mostly confused men in robes holding leeches. And the general population believes that if your cow dies suddenly, it's because someone nearby made a pact with the devil. Now, most of us imagine witch trials as a kind of male crusade against female independence. And fair enough. That's true in many ways. But early on, before the hysteria turned industrial, something more subtle was happening. Women were turning on each other. Picture a small European town. Let's call it Bruggendorf, because every witch-hunting town needs a name that sounds faintly unpronounceable. The year is around 1450, and life is fragile. Crops fail, children die young, husbands vanish into wars that never end. In these moments, power, especially for women, comes in whispers, reputations, and alliances. And that's where our first type of witch inventor appears, the accusing noble woman. Her name, historically speaking, could be anything. Let's take a real example. Lady Agnes Bernauer of Bavaria. Agnes wasn't exactly an accuser, but her story shows how accusations could be used by women to protect their own standing. She was beautiful, lower-born, and inconveniently married to a prince. And when royal women, her mother-in-law for instance, wanted her gone, they didn't need a sword, they just needed suspicion. Agnes was accused of witchcraft in 1435. Her offense? Being charming, politically awkward, and not noble enough. She was drowned in the Danube, a quiet, efficient solution that left everyone suitably horrified and conveniently restored the family's social balance. The tragedy of Agnes Bernauer marks one of the first high-profile uses of a witch accusation as a political housekeeping. It worked so well that others noticed. In the decades that followed, accusations became a way to manage social competition among women. A noble wife might quietly suggest that her husband's mistress was seen muttering to a cat. An abbess might claim a rival nun's prayers smelled of sulfur. And local healers, women with knowledge of herbs, were especially vulnerable, because if your remedies worked too well, people said you had help from darker forces. In this environment, women realized that silence was dangerous, but speaking first could save you. It was like a medieval version of social media drama, only instead of subtweets, there were burnings. Now, it's important to say not all women who accused others were malicious. Some were genuinely terrified. Imagine living in a world where illness, storms, and stillbirths all seem to have spiritual causes. Fear was a kind of background radiation, constant, invisible, and exhausting. In small communities, the local midwife or herbalist was both essential and suspicious. She knew secrets about birth, fertility, and death. If a birth went wrong, people whispered. If it went well, they whispered too. And sometimes it was other women, grieving mothers, jealous wives, who whispered the loudest. One fascinating figure is Walpurga Hausmannen, an Austrian midwife executed for witchcraft in 1587. She confessed, under the usual encouragement of torture, to killing 40 children through sorcery. But what's often forgotten is who first accused her. Another woman, a fellow midwife. Historians now think jealousy and professional rivalry were the sparks. Walpurga was popular. Her patients loved her. Her competitor did not. So, in a small town where misfortune always needed a cause, witch was a convenient label. And once the accusation began, the machinery of belief did the rest. Soon everyone remembered something odd about Walpurga, something they'd ignored before. That's how fear works. It edits memory. Let's drift now to the convents, those quiet stone fortresses filled with incense, prayer, and internal politics sharp enough to cut glass. You might expect nuns to be above such things. They were not. During the 15th and 16th centuries, several convents across Europe experienced possession outbreaks. Dozens of nuns would claim to be tormented by demons. And of course, someone had to be blamed for inviting the demons in. Often, it was another nun, usually the one who was a bit too pious, or too pretty, or too different. The abbess, conveniently, would then step in as the savior, performing exorcisms and gaining holy prestige. In some cases, the abbess herself may have started the rumors, because naturally, nothing cements leadership like expelling an imaginary devil. One famous case took place in Loudun, France, where the Ursuline nuns claimed possession in 1634, while the central figure was a male priest, Urbain Grandier. The hysteria spread primarily through women accusing women. It was spiritual theater, and the audience was the entire country. The superior nun at Loudun, Jeanne d'Ange, became a national celebrity for her supposed purity and resilience. And although history later viewed her as deeply disturbed, at the time, she wielded real influence. Her suffering made her powerful. And that's the dark irony here. Witch hunts gave some women status. If you were the accuser, the visionary, or the self-proclaimed victim of spiritual attack, you were untouchable. For once, men had to listen to you. In many small towns, local witch finders weren't men with official titles, they were older women, often widows, respected or simply too stubborn to ignore. They'd lead the charge, interpreting signs, naming names. And if they pointed their finger at someone, that someone rarely had a chance. It was, in a grim way, a redistribution of power, built entirely on fear. Let's pause for a moment. You might be wondering, why did women believe each other's accusations? Why didn't they stand together? Well, the truth is, solidarity is hard to maintain when survival depends on conformity. In a society where obedience was safety, suspicion was self-defense, and the line between victim and perpetrator was thin as smoke. Some historians call this the horizontal violence of patriarchy, when those with limited power turn on one another because vertical resistance is impossible. It's not exactly comforting, but it's human. Back in Germany, the witch panic reached industrial scale in the late 1500s. In some towns, entire families vanished. But before the great fires of Würzburg and Bamberg, there were dozens of smaller, quieter trials, each sparked by personal feuds. Letters from that period show noblewomen writing to officials urging them to investigate suspicious widows on their estates. Sometimes the motives were pragmatic, fear of contagion, maintaining order. Other times, pettier. Land disputes, servants who talked back, a midwife who disapproved of someone's affair.
Witchcraft was a legal label, but the crime was almost always personal. And the church, it mostly followed the crowd. The famous Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by two inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jakob Sprenger, framed witchcraft as a specifically female evil. But what's often forgotten is that Kramer's obsession began because a group of nuns in Innsbruck accused each other of sorcery, and then accused him of harassment. He retaliated with a book. So yes, the manual that justified centuries of burnings started as a man's revenge against a group of women who wouldn't flirt back. Naturally. As the 16th century progressed, witch hunting became bureaucratic, complete with forms, fees, and quotas. By then, the female accusers had mostly been replaced by professional interrogators, but their early role had already shaped the narrative. Witches were women, and women were dangerous. Still, even during the height of the panic, female accusers persisted. In Scotland, during the North Berwick trials of 1590, one of the key informants was Agnes Sampson, a healer turned accuser. Under torture, she implicated dozens of others, including the Queen's own servants. Her statements were inconsistent, possibly fabricated, but devastatingly effective. The cycle repeated again and again. Women accusing women to survive in a system designed to destroy them both. And perhaps that's the most haunting part. When we picture a witch hunt, we see terrified women dragged before grim-faced men. But behind many of those scenes were whispers from other women, neighbors, rivals, even friends, each trying to stay one step ahead of fate. It wasn't simple cruelty. It was a kind of tragic logic. In a world that refused to give women real power, some learned to weaponize the only thing available: fear. So tonight, as we drift deeper into the soft candlelight of this history, remember that the invention of the witch hunt wasn't the work of monsters, but of people, frightened, clever, desperate to control their own stories. And in doing so, they created one of the most enduring nightmares in European memory. Let's drift over to the next royal fiasco. So let's drift now from the village square to the marble corridors of power, where witchcraft was no longer about dead cows in bad weather, but about inheritance, politics, and perfume. Because once the lower classes started burning each other, the nobility, as always, wanted in on the trend. And by the late 1500s, witch hunting had become not just a superstition, but a fashion statement. Royal courts loved novelty. They adored anything that glittered, gossiped, or gave them an excuse to feel spiritually superior. And in that climate, the idea of witchcraft at court was irresistible. After all, if the peasants had their old crones muttering over cauldrons, the nobility deserved a higher class version, something with lace cuffs, poisoned love spells, and expensive scandals. So they turned suspicion into a form of entertainment, half moral panic, half theater. And women, again, were often the lead actors. Let's start with Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France,
and possibly the most elegant practitioner of fear in European history. Catherine wasn't a witch herself, though many said she was. She simply had an interest in astrology, alchemy, and making sure her sons stayed alive long enough to inherit the throne. Small goals. Her court in the mid-1500s was a glittering mix of perfume, poison, and paranoia. Everyone suspected everyone else. And Catherine, always the strategist, quietly encouraged it. When her son, King Charles IX, suffered mysterious fits, some blamed witchcraft. Others blamed politics. Catherine blamed whichever explanation was most useful that week. Behind her, the ladies of the French court began copying her fascination with charms and horoscopes. Every duchess had her own astrologer, every countess her own wise woman. What began as private superstition soon became social currency. If you didn't dabble in the occult, you were dull. If you dabbled too much, you were dangerous. The trick was balance, something most courtiers lacked entirely.
Around the same time in Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots, was fighting her own battle with her reputation. Mary had charm, education, and a talent for marrying the wrong men. She also had a kingdom obsessed with witchcraft. When her husband, Lord Darnley, died under suspiciously explosive circumstances, literally, rumors of sorcery spread faster than the fire itself. Mary's enemies claimed she used dark magic to seduce and murder. Her supporters claimed the same thing, but as a compliment. Either way, the narrative stuck. In the Scottish imagination, powerful women and witchcraft were practically synonyms. And so, when Mary fled to England and fell into Elizabeth I's cautious hands, the idea of queens and curses was already part of royal gossip. Now, Elizabeth herself was too practical to believe in witches, publicly at least, but her court still indulged in elegant paranoia. There was one notable scandal in 1578. Lady Mary Sidney, sister to the poet Philip Sidney, was accused of using strange powders to charm favor at court. It turned out to be face powder. But in the 16th century, there wasn't much difference. Anything that altered appearance was suspicious. So Elizabeth handled it the way she handled most things. She smiled, ignored it, and commissioned another portrait. Because nothing banishes rumor like a flattering painting. Meanwhile, across the Channel, things were getting far less subtle. In 1590s France, the affair of the poisons turned witch hunting into an aristocratic blood sport. It began innocently enough, with a few fashionable ladies buying love potions. It ended with over 300 people executed or imprisoned, including nobles, priests, and at least one royal mistress. At the center was Catherine Monvoisin, better known as La Voisin, fortune teller, abortionist, and supplier of potions to half of Paris. Her client list read like a gossip column. Duchesses, marquises, even Madame de Montespan, the king's favorite companion. When the affair broke, Louis XIV was appalled, mostly that his name appeared in testimony. To preserve royal dignity, he declared further investigation unnecessary and ordered several witnesses to stop existing. But behind the executions lay a fascinating truth. Many of these women weren't practicing witchcraft. They were practicing agency in a society that gave them almost none. Love potions, charms, and fortune readings were ways to exert control in a world run by men. Unfortunately, that kind of independence was indistinguishable from heresy. Of course, noble women weren't always the accused. Sometimes they directed the accusations, turning witchcraft into a tool of elimination. Consider Anne of Denmark, wife of King James VI of Scotland, later James I of England. In 1590, on her way to marry James, Anne's ship was struck by terrible storms. Naturally, someone had to be blamed. So the king, ever the theologian, decided it was witches. He personally oversaw the North Berwick witch trials, interrogating women accused of conjuring storms. And who supported him most loyally through it all? Anne. Historians suspect she genuinely believed in witchcraft. Others think she realized how useful it was to demonstrate piety through shared outrage. Either way, she and James turned the trials into court entertainment. He even wrote a book about it, Daemonology, which reads like a cross between a horror story and a legal manual written by someone slightly too enthusiastic. Under their rule, accusing witches became an act of royal loyalty, and from there the fashion spread through the aristocracy like a contagion of moral virtue. Let's drift further north for a moment, to Scandinavia, where witchcraft was a slower import. In Denmark and Sweden, the panic didn't fully bloom until the 17th century, and predictably, once it reached the royal courts, it became less about demons and more about decorum. At the Swedish court of Queen Christina, who later abdicated and became one of Europe's more eccentric thinkers, witchcraft rumors were a kind of conversational garnish. Christina herself was accused of possessing strange books and foreign curiosities, which was true. She just preferred Descartes to demons. But the ladies who followed her? They weaponized rumor like perfume, applied liberally and for maximum effect. A whisper that someone had consorted with spirits could end a career or ruin a marriage alliance faster than any duel. It was essentially character assassination through theology. Meanwhile, in the smaller German principalities, those tiny states that multiplied like rabbits, the noble courts tried to imitate royal grandeur. Lacking money, they compensated with piety, and witch trials offered cheap spectacle. One duchess, Dorothea Elizabeth of Saxe-Weimar, presided over local investigations, as if hosting a masquerade. Witnesses described her appearing in glittering gowns, questioning prisoners in candlelight, then retiring to supper. Executions were followed by balls. Because, naturally, nothing says divine justice like a well-choreographed waltz.
Behind the absurdity lay politics. Witchcraft accusations were a way to purge rivals, consolidate estates, and display virtue without risking war. It was theater, bloody, yes, but still theater. And the audience always demanded more. By the early 1600s, pamphlets about witches became bestsellers. Illustrations showed elegant ladies dancing with demons in flowing gowns that looked suspiciously like last season's Paris fashion. The message was moral, but the marketing was sensual. It was, in short, profitable hypocrisy. In England, things took a slightly more Protestant tone. There, witchcraft was less about black masses and more about household rebellion. But even so, the court couldn't resist dabbling. Under James I, witch trials reached new heights of royal endorsement. The king genuinely saw himself as Europe's foremost expert on demons. He held scholarly discussions about them between hunting trips. He also enjoyed watching interrogations, though to his credit, he preferred intellectual humiliation to torture. For court ladies, being visibly horrified by witchcraft became fashionable. They'd attend sermons about possession, clutching pearls with spiritual intensity. It was performative morality, the ancestor of today's virtue signaling, just with more ruffles. But perhaps the most striking example of witchcraft as politics comes from the story of Johanna of Navarre, Duchess of Brittany, and later Queen of England. In 1419, long before the Great Panics, she was accused of attempting to kill her stepson, King Henry V, through witchcraft. The evidence, a few strange amulets, and the testimony of a friar with creative imagination. Johanna was imprisoned for 3 years, her fortune seized. When Henry died, she was quietly released. The entire episode had been a political maneuver by courtiers who disliked her influence. No demons required, just paperwork and opportunism. Her story set a precedent that a queen could be neutralized by theology, a useful lesson and one future nobles learned quickly. As we drift through these centuries of scandal and incense, a pattern emerges. Every accusation, every trial, every bewitched courtier followed the same logic. Fear disguised as morality, envy disguised as faith. And yet within this grim fashion, there was something oddly human. People needed explanations. Kings needed enemies. Women needed survival strategies. Witchcraft provided all three. By the late 1600s, the trend began to fade, not because anyone became more rational, but because it was becoming embarrassing. Enlightenment philosophers started writing polite essays about how ridiculous it all was. Royal courts, always sensitive to style, moved on to new fads: mysticism, salon culture, and powdered wigs. Witch hunting was suddenly provincial, unfashionable, and worst of all, middle class. But even as the fires died out, their smoke lingered. The same logic, the same suspicion of women's influence, simply changed costumes. What had once been called witchcraft would soon be labeled hysteria, manipulation, seduction. Different words, but same discomfort. So as you rest your head tonight, imagine those royal corridors lit by candles and ambition, perfume masking smoke, queens whispering about potions, duchesses plotting over goblets of wine, and in every corner a faint scent of fear dressed as faith. Because for nearly 2 centuries, witch hunting wasn't just a tragedy of ignorance, it was an art form, refined, rehearsed, and disastrously fashionable. So let's drift onward then to the next strange chapter, where the same obsession that once condemned women will be reinvented by men, scientists, physicians, and philosophers who claimed to have replaced superstition with reason. Naturally, they didn't.
All right, let's ease forward a few centuries. The bonfires are cooling, the air smells a little less of smoke and a little more of Enlightenment pamphlets. We've entered what historians, with admirable optimism, call the Age of Reason. Witch hunts are now considered vulgar, unscientific, and most damning of all, unfashionable. Europe congratulates itself on being terribly modern. Of course, that doesn't mean anyone has stopped fearing women. They've simply rebranded it. In the 1700s, the language of faith gives way to the language of medicine. The church loses its monopoly on diagnosing evil, and the physicians step in eagerly, clipboards in hand, metaphorically speaking. They rename witchcraft hysteria. It sounds smarter in Latin. And the beauty of the new term is that it keeps all the old assumptions, that women are mysterious, unstable, and somehow responsible for everyone else's discomfort. Picture a Gentile London drawing room around 1750. A woman faints from a tight corset and decades of emotional repression. A physician is summoned. He peers solemnly over his spectacles and announces, "The vapors." No demons, just uterus trouble. This is progress. By the mid-18th century, medical textbooks are filled with elegant nonsense about the female body. Doctors describe the womb as a wandering creature, restless, mischievous, occasionally climbing into the throat to strangle its owner. Naturally, this required treatment. The remedies ranged from cold baths to marriage to a nice dose of opium. Sometimes all three,
depending on how expensive the patient was. And though the vocabulary has changed, the idea is familiar. When a woman behaves inconveniently, something inside her must be possessed by hysteria, nerves, or excess imagination. Meanwhile, philosophers are busy explaining the world in essays no one asked for. Voltaire dismisses witchcraft as superstition. Diderot insists the mind is mechanical. And Rousseau, bless him, writes entire volumes on women's natural place, proving that reason can be as bit as patronizing as religion. They've burned the witches, yes, but they've kept the script. In polite society, seances replace trials. Instead of accusing the neighbor of flying to Sabbaths, the fashionable now invite spirits to tea. By the early 1800s, spiritualism becomes a charming hobby for bored aristocrats and disappointed romantics. It starts in America with the Fox sisters, two clever girls cracking their toes under a table, and drifts gracefully across the Atlantic like scented smoke. In drawing rooms from Paris to St. Petersburg, candles are dimmed, hands are joined, and someone's deceased aunt allegedly knocks on the wall. The same people who once demanded witches confess now demand spirits perform. The gender balance hasn't changed much. Women still serve as the conduit to the unseen, only now they're called mediums instead of minions of Satan. Progress, again.
One of the most celebrated of these mediums is Daniel Douglas Home, a Scottish gentleman who levitates in front of half of Europe's crowned heads. But note how many of his imitators are women, young, pale, fragile-looking. Being delicate becomes a career path. They tremble, they swoon, they speak in voices not quite their own. Scientists arrive with measuring tapes and skepticism, but also fascination. The seance table becomes the new operating theater. If she produces ectoplasm, she's famous. If she doesn't, she's accused of fraud. It's safer than being accused of witchcraft, though not by much. Let's pause a moment in Paris, around 1850. Hospitals have become laboratories of the soul. At the Salpêtrière Asylum, Jean-Martin Charcot teaches young medical students how to classify hysteria. His favorite demonstration subject, a teenage girl named Blanche Whitman. Under hypnosis, Blanche convulses, screams, and freezes in graceful poses that Charcot names like ballet positions. Attitude passionnelle, arc de cercle. Artists sketch her. Visitors applaud. It's science, but also theater again. And Charcot's star pupil, a certain Sigmund Freud, takes careful notes. He'll later decide that witchcraft, hysteria, and neuroses are all variations of repressed desire, which is, if nothing else, creative. So, after centuries of torture and fire, the official explanation for women's strangeness becomes psychology. Less smoke, same confusion. Meanwhile, outside the lecture halls, society can't quite let go of its ghosts. Victorian England loves contradictions. It builds railways in seances, factories in fairy societies. Queen Victoria herself, that stern icon of duty, spends years consulting mediums to speak with her late husband, Prince Albert. She calls it comfort, not witchcraft, which makes all the difference. Her courtiers follow suit. Where once they whispered about hexes, they now exchange anecdotes about table rapping and ectoplasm over dinner. Everyone pretends it's intellectual inquiry. Really, it's grief with better lighting. Across the ocean, the spiritualist revival merges with early feminism in curious ways. Mediumship offers women a rare form of authority, the right to speak publicly, to lecture men, even to make money. They do it, of course, through the convenient excuse of spirit control. If a woman preaches politics in her own voice, she's scandalous. If she claims a dead man told her to, she's inspirational. So seances become both a parody and an escape from patriarchy, part theater, part therapy.
the line between possession and liberation blurs once again. By the late 19th century, science starts testing everything, even the invisible. Societies for psychical research pop up in London and Cambridge, peopled by professors who attend seances with notebooks instead of crucifixes. They record the flicker of candle flames, the temperature of the room, the occasional flying trumpet. It's the same impulse that once drove inquisitors. Measure, categorize, control. Only the vocabulary has changed. Instead of demons, they write about psychic force. Instead of exorcism, they propose experiments. You can almost hear the collective sigh of history. We've learned nothing, but at least we're documenting it.
Meanwhile, the public grows restless. Industrial progress has made life faster, dirtier, and somehow emptier. Machines replace miracles, but people still crave wonder. Spiritualism, mesmerism, phrenology, each promises to fill the same old void with new, respectable nonsense. And through it all, the focus remains curiously gendered. The sensitive female organism, doctors write, is particularly attuned to magnetic forces. Translation: women still make the best scapegoats and entertainment. Let's visit Vienna around 1900. Freud is pacing. His patient, a young woman he calls Anna O., is recounting dreams of serpents and water glasses. He listens, nods, and decides that hysteria is not a disease of the womb after all, but of the unconscious. He's right, in a way, but his case studies read like ghost stories with footnotes. Every mysterious symptom becomes metaphor. Every metaphor, inevitably, leads back to sex. It's almost poetic. Almost. The witches have been replaced by the analysts, the stake by the couch. Confession remains compulsory. Outside, modernity hums. Telegraphs, typewriters, suffragettes. The world insists it no longer believes in magic. Yet seances continue in basements, and tabloids still print stories about cursed jewels and haunted houses. Because reason can banish demons from theology, but not from imagination. And the human imagination, left unsupervised, always rewrites old fears in new fonts. Let's drift for a moment through the quieter corners of this new century. A nurse in London consults palm readers between shifts. A duchess in Vienna keeps a crystal under her pillow for magnetism. A factory girl attends a lecture on hypnotism and wonders if it could make her supervisor nicer. Different classes, same longing. To believe that unseen forces shape their lives, and that perhaps, just perhaps, they can learn to command them. It's the same longing that sent villagers accusing midwives, queens plotting with astrologers, and philosophers dissecting hysteria. The need to name what we can't control. By the time the First World War arrives, belief itself is exhausted. Millions die without miracles. After that, even the most enthusiastic medium finds it hard to compete with artillery. But once peace limps back, the seances resume. So many dead to contact, so many questions unanswered. The spiritualist boom of the 1920s is less about witches than about widows. This time, men join in earnestly. Soldiers' fathers, politicians,
even scientists hoping for consolation. The ghosts are democratic now, but the pattern persists. The same rituals of control disguised as faith, the same fragile hope that knowledge can conquer loss.
If we step back, the centuries form a slow metamorphosis. First came demons, then diagnoses, then devices. Each promised certainty, and each quietly carried the same anxiety about power, gender, and mystery. The witch's broom becomes the medium's trumpet, becomes the psychologist's inkblot. Different props, same performance. So perhaps the Age of Reason was never quite as reasonable as it claimed. It simply replaced fire with fluorescence, confession with case studies. The fear of female unpredictability, of intuition, emotion, imagination, remained intact, only now wrapped in the soothing language of science. Progress often works that way. We don't abolish our ghosts, we give them tenure. Let's slow down now. Imagine the candlelight of a lecture hall in 1890. Students scribbling, a skeleton model looming in the corner. The professor declares, "We have left superstition behind." Outside, the wind rattles the windows, and a patient in the ward below begins to dream of flying. Old habits die quietly. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, remember this gentle paradox. The witches were burned, the mediums applauded, the hysterics analyzed, and through it all, humanity kept trying to name the same shadow. We still do. Only now we call it anxiety, intuition, energy, mood. Different century, same spell. Rest easy. History rarely learns its lesson the first time. The 20th century begins not with fire, but with electricity. Light bulbs replace candles, machines hum where monks once prayed. And yet, in the corner of every modern room, there's still a flicker of something ancient, a shadow that doesn't belong to science. The witch hasn't vanished. She's just gone underground. For now. After centuries of accusation, she becomes an idea, something whispered by poets, painted by symbolists, resurrected by dreamers who never quite believed the Enlightenment's promise of perfect order. In the 1910s, 1920s, and 1930s, Europe dances on the fault line between ruin and Renaissance. The old certainties, God, empire, reason, are collapsing. And into that collapse seeps mysticism. Astrology, tarot, theosophy, occult orders. Aleister Crowley scrawls his sigils. Madame Blavatsky writes about ancient masters. Their followers wear robes, light incense, and pretend to be modern while reenacting medieval magic with better stationery. And once again, women are both central and suspect. They lead seances, publish horoscopes, write dream manuals, but they must always couch it in the language of art or exoticism. A woman calling herself a witch is still a dangerous proposition, unless, of course, she means it metaphorically. Then the world ends, twice. World War I, then World War II. Two infernos, not of superstition this time, but of industry. And when the smoke clears, humanity is exhausted. The atomic age dawns. Technology promises control over nature itself. Yet in the quiet aftermath, many people start to feel something has gone missing. Something older, softer, spiritual. The modern world is dazzling but disenchanted,
and nature, long subjugated, starts whispering again. It's here, in the mid-20th century, that the witch begins her slow, deliberate resurrection, but not from the church or the universities, from the margins, as always. In 1954, a retired British civil servant named Gerald Gardner publishes Witchcraft Today. He claims that witchcraft, real witchcraft, never died, that beneath the ashes of the trials, a secret pagan religion has survived, one that worships the goddess, honors the earth, and celebrates freedom of the body and spirit. He calls it Wicca.
Gardner's book isn't exactly historical, half folklore, half fantasy, but it hits a nerve. Post-war Britain, gray and rationed, finds the idea intoxicating, a hidden, sensual spirituality older than Christianity, untouched by guilt. Soon, covens sprout like mushrooms after rain. They meet in suburban living rooms, not forests. They read poetry instead of grimoires. But in their candles and chants, something ancient stirs again. For the first time in centuries, being a witch is no longer a crime. It's an identity. By the 1960s, the word begins to shimmer with new meanings. The world is changing fast. Civil rights, sexual liberation, feminism, protest. The witch becomes a symbol of rebellion against every kind of authority. Her broom is not a weapon now, but a statement. I will fly where you said I couldn't. Magazines print articles titled, Witchcraft is a Woman's Religion. Young feminists wear pentagrams instead of crosses. They quote Gardner and the ancient myths of the goddess, Gaia, Diana, Hecate. It's half politics, half poetry, but it feels like power. In America, a woman named Zuzana Budapest founds the feminist Wicca movement, declaring that witchcraft is the oldest women's religion in the world. Another, Starhawk, writes The Spiral Dance, a blend of activism, spirituality, and environmentalism that becomes a Bible for a new generation of witches. Their witches aren't cackling villains. They're midwives, artists, rebels, healers. They gather not in secret, but in circles, hands joined, chanting under the moon, reclaiming words once used to destroy them. Meanwhile, television takes notice. Hollywood, always hungry for archetypes, rediscovers the witch. But now she wears eyeliner and a knowing smile. In the 1960s, Bewitched airs, a sitcom where a charming suburban witch tries to live a normal domestic life. Samantha twitches her nose and the dishes wash themselves. The message is deliciously subversive. The witch could run the world, but politely doesn't. Millions of viewers adore her. She's everything the medieval church feared: competent, playful, powerful, and popular. From there, she multiplies. Bell, Book and Candle, The Witches of Eastwick, Practical Magic, Sabrina the Teenage Witch. Each version glows a little brighter, a little freer. The witch becomes a lens for whatever the culture is wrestling with. In the 1970s, she's feminist. In the 1980s, gothic. In the 1990s, mystical and cool, filtered through pop music and moonlight. Teenagers in mall bookstores buy spell books. Silver pentagrams hang beside crystal necklaces. Everyone wants to be a little witchy.
Of course, some historians grumble that it's all shallow consumerism, and they're partly right. But symbols have a way of slipping free from their packaging. Even in glitter and movie magic, the witch carries something deeper, that stubborn sense of female autonomy, the right to speak, to choose, to know. She no longer needs to hide in the woods. She can appear on a magazine cover, or a protest poster, or a Halloween costume that's half joke, half invocation.
because the witch has always known how to wear masks. Let's pause here, because the 20th century isn't just revival, it's reclamation. For centuries, witch was a word meant to wound. Now, women start to say it proudly, like armor. In the 1970s, feminist groups march under banners reading, "We are the granddaughters of the witches you couldn't burn." It's not literal, of course, but it doesn't need to be. It's a spell spoken to bind the past and the present, to turn trauma into power. Every slogan, every chant is a kind of magic. The witch becomes a teacher, again, this time about resistance, ecology, intuition. She speaks of the sacredness of nature long before climate change becomes a headline. She teaches that power can come from cycles, not hierarchies. That control isn't strength, connection is. Modern witches plant gardens instead of casting curses. They study herbalism, astrology, mindfulness. They hold solstice festivals in city parks. And while some scoff, others listen. Because, perhaps, after all the empires and ideologies, people are ready to believe in something rooted in the soil again. The 21st century arrives, glowing with screens. Magic moves online. Coven meetings happen over video calls. Spells are shared on social media. Hashtags and moon emojis replacing parchment and ink. TikTok witches stir herbal teas, draw sigils, speak about manifestation and trauma healing. Some of it's sincere, some of it's parody, but the reach is enormous. The witch is now global, digital, diverse, democratized. And somewhere in the scroll of all that content, you can still sense the old rhythm, the longing to control what feels uncontrollable, to name what frightens us, to reclaim what was taken. It's strange, isn't it? After everything, the fires, the trials, the hysteria, the witch has not only survived, she's thriving. She's in our language. Witch hunt now means injustice. She's in our art, our politics, our self-help books. She sells candles and rebellion in the same breath. And whether you believe in magic or not, you can't quite shake her presence. She's the whisper that says, "You were told you were powerless. You were lied to."
But this rebirth isn't pure fantasy. It carries a quiet responsibility, too. Because every time we say witch, we summon centuries of pain. The voices of those who didn't get to reclaim the word. The women, and men too, who vanished into fire or silence. They're part of the spell as well. The modern witch stands not apart from them, but because of them. That's what makes her more than a pop icon. She's memory wrapped in moonlight. If you walk into a bookstore now, you'll find entire shelves labeled witchcraft and wellness. Next to yoga manuals, you'll see grimoires rewritten as guides to empowerment. The covers glisten with stars, vines, and affirmations. It's all very modern and very old. And somewhere you suspect the universe smiles faintly. Because the witches were right about one thing. Power isn't something you seize, it's something you remember. So here we are, from bonfire to bookshelf, from accusation to aspiration. The witch has completed the longest transformation arc in history. She began as a threat. She became a theory. She ended as a mirror. Now she reflects what each era fears or desires most, and what each woman perhaps knows deep down, that there's magic in surviving, and power in being impossible to define.
So if you ever light a candle and watch the flame bend slightly as you breathe, remember, once upon a time, that flicker was enough to condemn someone. Now, it's just light. Gentle, steady, human. And maybe that's the real spell we've cast, to turn fear into fascination and silence into story.
Hey everyone, if you're still awake, and I wouldn't blame you if you're not, we've drifted quite far tonight. We began in the flickering dark of medieval kitchens, where suspicion was as common as bread, and we end now in a world lit by phones that glow like tiny hearths. And still, somehow, the witch remains. It's tempting to think she survived because people love a good story, which, of course, they do, but it's deeper than that. The witch endures because she's useful, and not just for Halloween decorations or metaphors. She's the shape we pour our fears into when the world doesn't make sense. And she's the figure we pull strength from when we realize no one's coming to save us. A convenient villain, a convenient hero, both depending on who's telling the tale. Every culture, in some form, has its witch. A woman too old, too clever, too independent, too unwilling to stay in her assigned lane. In Europe, she brewed potions. In West Africa, she flew at night. In Japan, she turned into a fox. In the Americas, she whispered in the woods. Different languages, same energy. Someone who bends the rules of nature and therefore must pay the price or reap the power. It's almost comforting how predictable we are about it. If you look closely, the witch is never really about magic. She's about boundaries. Who's allowed to heal? Who's allowed to know? Who's allowed to speak? And what happens when they do? When society says, "You've gone too far," the witch quietly replies, "Yes, that's the idea." Through the centuries, she's worn many faces. The midwife who knew too much, the mistress who refused to vanish, the widow who wouldn't remarry, the scientist who asked the wrong questions, the artist who painted what no one wanted to see. Every era has its heretics, but it's the witch who gathers them all under one crooked hat. And maybe that's why she lingers, because she's never really about them, the accusers, the hunters, the trials. She's about us. Our need to explain why bad things happen, our longing to believe someone, somewhere, has control. When crops failed, we blamed the witch. When storms struck, we blamed the witch. When love soured, when babies cried, when anything went wrong, we built our certainty on someone else's ashes. That's the real magic, turning fear into conviction. It's one of humanity's oldest tricks.
But the witch is also the proof of something gentler, our refusal to let stories die. We burned them, we banned them, and then we wrote them back into existence. Because even the people who claimed to hate her couldn't stop talking about her. She appears in court transcripts, sermons, children's tales, Shakespeare's plays, Disney's movies. No matter what, she finds a way in, like smoke through keyholes. By the 21st century, she's no longer a woman at all, but an idea, the last ember of the irrational in an age obsessed with logic. We've mapped the human genome, photographed black holes, invented machines that talk to us at 3 a.m. And still, some part of us wants to whisper a spell before a first date, or avoid walking under a ladder. We say we don't believe in magic, but we knock on wood. make wishes on candles, and tell ourselves the universe is listening. We never stopped believing. We just changed the vocabulary. If you listen closely, the witch teaches two lessons. The first is what happens when power and fear hold hands. The second is how to live anyway. The history of witch hunts is a cautionary tale of what fear can do when it puts on the robes of righteousness. But it's also a survival manual, written in reverse. Every time the witch reappears, in Wicca, in feminism, in folklore, in memes, she's saying, I'm still here, and I remember what you did, but I'm not gone. She's not a ghost. She's a reminder. Think of how strange it is that the figure used to justify thousands of deaths is now a symbol of self-knowledge and empathy. It's a kind of historical alchemy, turning lead into gold, shame into identity. Where once witch meant danger, now it means independence, intuition, the right to stand alone under a full moon and feel something ancient hum inside you. Not bad for a word that once ended lives.
And she keeps evolving. Every generation remakes her in its image. The 17th century saw her as evil, the 19th saw her as tragic, the 20th saw her as empowered, and the 21st? Maybe we see her as balanced, neither curse nor saint, just human, with all the contradictions that word contains. Capable of cruelty, capable of tenderness, capable of transformation. That's what makes her eternal. There's also something oddly comforting about her persistence. Civilizations rise and fall, belief systems shift, languages disappear, and yet the witch keeps turning up, dusting herself off, rolling her eyes and saying, "Really? We're doing this again?" It's the ultimate act of endurance. She doesn't need to win. She just needs to outlast, and she always does. Somewhere, a historian might still insist that witch trials were just about social control. And they were. But they were also about imagination, the human capacity to believe in the invisible, for good or ill. Without that same imagination, we wouldn't have art, or science, or love, or even the urge to tell stories like this. So, maybe the witch doesn't just represent the fear of knowledge. Maybe she represents the desire for it, the dangerous curiosity that makes us human, the willingness to peek behind the curtain even when we're told not to. If you've ever stayed up too late reading, searching, wondering, you've already done what she did. You've crossed the line between what is and what if. And that, in the end, is all witchcraft ever was. A little knowledge, a little rebellion, and a little faith in the unseen.
So perhaps it's fitting that we end here, in the quiet. No torches, no screaming crowds, just you, a dim light, and the thought that every accusation, every legend, every charm has been leading to this moment. A world where the witch can simply exist. Not feared, not worshipped, just acknowledged. That's progress in its own crooked way. Before we drift off completely, let's remember something else, too. The Witch is not only a story about women. It's a story about how societies treat difference, how we react to what we don't understand. Today, we may not burn people in fields, but we still exile, still mock, still silence, just with different tools. The Witch's Tale is a mirror, and it's uncomfortably honest. The real test of enlightenment isn't whether we stopped believing in magic, it's whether we stopped needing enemies.
So if you ever find yourself thinking of the witch again, in a movie, in a headline, in a passing thought, remember she's less a monster than a mood, a flicker of resistance, a whisper of mystery, a soft reminder that the world is stranger and kinder than the rules allow. And maybe, as you close your eyes tonight, you can let her stand guard for you. Not the cackling crone or the glowing heroine, but the quiet watcher at the edge of reason. The one who knows the darkness, but doesn't fear it. The one who listens. The one who stays. Because, after all these centuries, that's what the witch has always done best. She stays. Sleep well. And if you dream of a woman by the firelight, stirring something unseen, don't be afraid. She's just checking that the story was told correctly.